Ready? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Thought we'd take just a few minutes before we move on with McGilchrist to talk about the gospel of the day that we heard during our Malebin. And it's, very, very powerful. And I don't know how many of you, when you heard it being read or read it today earlier, if you read it, just thought, wow, that just kind of feels like you can feel this gospel in the air of where we are right now. Everyone to whom much is given, of him will much be required, and of him to whom men commit much, they will demand the more. I think that's a very interesting passage to think about in reference to pro-life ministry. It's very tempting, I think, for us to think, well, that refers to politicians. That refers to people who have been given power and who have been given responsibility, and so they better live up to it. And it does do that. I mean, I think that's exactly what the Lord means. But I think that on a certain level, it means us. To him whom much is given, much will be required. And one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, as Orthodox Christians, we have been given so much. And I've said this before, but our Orthodox moral teaching requires that we have an Orthodox life to support it. We don't see our moral teaching as simply the imposition of God's rule or law without reference to a life that sustains it. And I think that's also very interesting. If you recall, when we were talking about Charles Taylor in his account of the unfolding of modernity, one of the things that happens as Christianity sort of warps and changes in the West is that the expectation of what is required of each and every believer sometimes has a tendency to change. And one of the weird things that happened in the Catholic Reformation in France following the French Revolution, if you recall, we were talking about this, is that the church essentially reduced dramatically through the demands of the sort of liberty movement, liberty and egalitarianism and all that. They started reducing the demands on the people, but they kept some really high. And this created a series of resentments and perception that the church was out of touch with life. In particular, he mentions young men and the whole question of sexuality and the relationship to confession and communion and the frustration with the church. And I don't know if we said this as clearly as we could have back then, but it's really important to note the problem wasn't that the church in the West was upholding its moral teaching. The problem is that it had evacuated the richness of the spiritual life that supports that moral teaching, right? It's not that you should have gotten rid of the moral teaching and then you would have been egalitarian towards all and then it would all be easier. It's that you shouldn't have gotten rid of the spiritual life. You shouldn't have reduced the fasting. You shouldn't have reduced this vibrant tapestry of the sacred uniting and binding all things within society, all things within culture. It's the dismantling, the unraveling, the unthreading of that sacred tapestry, but then holding on to just a couple sort of minimal things. You better do this or you don't have access, that Taylor describes as causing a problem in the mind of people in the West in terms of how they viewed the church and its discipline. And it's a reminder to us that we've never done that. We've never evacuated the faith from its demands, and therefore we shouldn't expect that less would be required of us because we've been given so more. And when it comes to pro-life ministry, what that means is that our task isn't simply to support things like illegalization of certain procedures. Our task is to give this life that we have received so that others may live fully, and so that for them, they may perceive the insanity of killing your own child, right? And this gets into intersection with McGilchrist, because one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is that a lot of times the way that we perceive reality, the way that we choose to pay attention, largely depends on the values we place on the things that we're attending to. Is the life of an innocent child more valuable than the freedom to have sex without consequence? Is the life of an infant more valuable than a career? When we die and go to heaven, is God going to ask us, tell me about your career? Let me hear and understand the way that you've maximized all the career opportunities. Did you ask enough for a raise? Did you work the extra time so that you advanced in the corporation? God's not going to care about any of that. But is he going to care about the life that we've born into the world, both physical life through the womb and through the seed, and the spiritual life through God fatherhood and God motherhood? Yes, he's going to ask us about that. Yes, we're going to answer for those things, which is why we have to answer for them now and not hold them off until later, because we've been given so much. We need to be careful that when we develop our way of seeing the world, we value the world as it is, as a sacred world, as an enchanted world, as we've been describing, as a world that's filled with meaning and connection and flow and relationality, interconnection, right? That's the way the world actually is. Another thing that we might say here is that Jesus, in this passage, criticizes them. He says, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you know how to read that sign. And when you see a south wind blowing, you know that heat is coming. But then he says, you hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? And that, too, is a marvelous intersection with our task before us as far as understanding the enchantment of the world, that we can develop the ability to read very accurately natural phenomena and be able to anticipate, like good meteorologists, what's going to happen. But what our Lord is saying is there's something deeper to pay attention to. There's something deeper to perceive. Don't stop with the surface of things. Don't stop with a merely scientific meteorological approach. Yes, you can look to the sky and you can see portents and you can see that something very powerful and important is happening, but it's not just heat. It's not just hail or wind or whatever. It's the presence of God himself, that we look to the world to perceive through the world the very presence of our God. And that is the sacramental life that we all live. I came to cast fire upon the earth, and wood that were already kindled. I've come for division, to set a house against itself. And here again, we can perhaps imagine the aftermath of a surprising election. I remember in 2016 when Trump won against Clinton, I was shocked. My own perspective on that matter was Clinton is the insider. She's got all the name recognition. She was ahead in the polls going into that night. Of course she's going to win, and Trump is going to lose. And then he won, and it was like, wow, that was unbelievable, right? Everything got turned on its head in that election. In many ways, everything got turned on its head in this election as well. I wasn't quite as shocked that Trump won this time, but I was still surprised that he won, if for no other reason that he was trailing the polls by 3 points going into the night. And it was a strange election with Biden dropping out and Harris only having a certain window and not going through the normal nominating procedures, and Trump seeming caught off guard by that change and not quite sure what he represented through anything other than he was really angry, right? And yet it resonated. And our ability to read that, our ability to read the mood and the spirit of the country, is also part of how we perceive and how we understand. And quite frankly, sometimes we have to have the humility of saying, wow, I was just wrong. you know, Nothing happened the way that I would thought it was going to happen there. And I need to look more closely, and I need to consider that more deeply. But anyway, that's a few things from our gospel tonight. We continue tonight with McGilchrist, which we've already started to talk about. And what I want to do tonight is complete a sort of introduction to his thought and read a few things in his own words so that we're really clear what he's talking about, and then look at some of the ways in which, if you were here last week or if you caught up on the online segment, the way that our brains work contributes to how we perceive the world in its reality. And what's really fascinating is I've begun to describe, but I think it'll be clear after tonight, more clear tonight than it was last week, that Charles Taylor in A Secular Age describes the broader sort of social, cultural, intellectual movements, particularly the Christian movements that lead from the medieval and late medieval world and into modernity and through modernity into the world today, where things have changed so much that we see the world very, very differently than people saw the world in the Middle Ages. Okay, so that I hope is very clear. That as Orthodox Christians, we're caught in this cross pressure that within this space we still see the world through the lens of a very pre-modern faith, a very pre-modern religion. We mean that in a good sense, although some people might say that pejoratively. Oh, you're pre-modern, you're irrelevant, you haven't been with it for 500 years, that sort of thing. But we continue to see the world in a sacramental way, in a sacred way, in an enchanted way, because of our Orthodox worldview, and yet we live in a world where we're pressured and pulled through an entirely secular, sort of mundane, desacralized, and disenchanted way of being in the world. And so Taylor is describing that and understanding how did it get to be, not that the case that the world was disenchanted, as we've said, because we don't believe it is. As Orthodox Christians, we don't believe the world is disenchanted. We believe we've chosen to see the world as disenchanted, but it remains enchanted. And once we learn how to see it as Orthodox Christians, once we learn to activate the eye of the heart or the soul, the nous, and perceive spiritually the inner essence of all things and the way that they are realized in the logos of God and within their own inner logoi, if you will, their own inner meaning, that we understand the world is sacred. The joy of the saints, the joy of someone like St. Seraphim of Sarov, is that they walk through every moment of every day seeing the glory of God in all things, seeing the presence of the angelic host, seeing saints and being reminded of the presence of saints, and living in this world of incredible spiritual beauty and connectedness. That is our world. It's not disenchanted. What happened, though, is we started looking at it in a different way. And even for those of us who were born and raised in the faith, we tend outside these walls to look at the world as if it's only there for our human flourishing, which is one of the key aspects of the secular flatness of the world, okay? And what McGilchrist, this neurobiologist, is going to be arguing is not that these changes that Taylor has described changed our brain. He's not describing that at all. He's an evolutionary biologist. You need a lot more than 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years to actually change in a broad base the way that the brain works. What he's saying is that the way the world changed tended to privilege a certain way of relating to the world that corresponds to the way that the left hemisphere of our brain functions. That we function best as biological and whole beings when we understand that both hemispheres of our brain work together to fill in the fabric of reality that we perceive. And I'm going to give you some concrete examples of what I'm talking about here, but we need both the left brain and the right brain, if we want to use that language. Both hemispheres of the brain work and intersect together, but they're also different. And when we separate them and when we experience trauma to one side of the brain or the other, it changes the way we experience reality. And through studying those changes, we begin to understand some of the strange ways that we have chosen to relate to the world by only asking questions of it that belong to the left hemisphere perspective and deprivileging the right. Let me say this in his own words, because I think this is so clear. This book is an attempt to convey a way of looking at the world quite different from the one that has largely dominated the West for at least 350 years. I believe we have systematically misunderstood the nature of reality and chosen to ignore or silence the minority of voices that have intuited as much and consistently maintained that this is the case. Now we have reached the point where there is an urgent need to transform both how we think of the world and what we make of ourselves. Attempting to convey such a richer insight is the ambition of this book. Now we've reached the point. What do you think he means by that? What is the point that we've reached that's sort of inspiring a, hey, folks, let's put the brakes on. I think we got something really wrong. Obviously, if you haven't read the book, that's an unfair question. But I find that very interesting to interrogate the book because I'm not sure. I think he's making some certain assumptions there, but I think one aspect is he's talking about the ecological crisis and whether or not we know we have the power to destroy our own world. And we know that from a certain angle, this power has been celebrated at times. If you go back to the beginning of the Enlightenment, a lot of times people were so enamored in the Enlightenment of the power of the human ingenuity and human reason and science to reshape the world that they almost thought destroying stuff just to show that we can is just a fun, cool thing to do. Let's move that mountain. Let's dig a new gorge. Let's cut a new path for the ocean. Let's hold back the water. Let's reshape the world for our own reasons. Our power over the world is intoxicating. It's almost its own form of enchantment to realize the power we have over our world. We know we can reshape it. We know that we can destroy it. Are we destroying it to some degree without realizing it now? Think of this whole thing about microplastics being in everything. In every glass of water you drink, you're drinking plastic. Did any of us sign up for that? You know, remember when bottles of water, you buy cases of bottles of water. Remember when that didn't exist? Drinking water meant like holding a glass under the tap, and that's the only way that you drank water was to hold the glass under the tap. And now we've done stuff to the world that have changed it. Now, some of it's minor, probably in the grand scheme of things. Has anyone proven the fact that there are microplastics in my heart and in your hearts right now? Has anyone proven that this is a problem? Not really. I mean, no one's saying that we're all going to keel over and die early because of all the microplastics that have leached into our system. But it's an example where someone got an idea of how to use science to advance the use of plastics for any number of purposes, including, by the way, like, let's put grainy bits in the shampoo and then not think what happens. Like, what are the grainy bits? They're plastic. It's waste, right? So it'll feel like we're giving a sea salt massage to our scalp. And then not realizing, but wait, where's all that going? It's going down the drain and out into the river and down the rivers and into the oceans, and now it's all over the planet, right? All because someone had the idea in the marketing department of some, like L'Oreal, to have grains in the shampoo. Like, we have this power. Have we overextended ourselves? And I think that's the fear for many people. Other people, no, everything's fine. It'll all be fine. It'll all regenerate if we needed to. But, we know we have the power. We know we can blow up the earth with nuclear weapons if we needed to. What happens if we don't have mutually assured destruction, right? And what has it been? Here's another thing that I think McGilchrist could mean by this, although I'm not sure he meant it at the time that this was written. I think when he says now we've reached the point where there's a need to transform both how we think of the world and what we make of ourselves, I think another example of this is AI. And I know we've talked about AI a little bit, and I know that there's been a lot of hand-wringing about AI. What's it going to do? Is it going to gain self-awareness and decide that we're the enemy and attack us? I don't know. Some people seem to have a fear of that. But I think this is just my completely, you can take this or leave it. I think the real danger of AI is, as we'll see, one of the main themes of the way the left hemisphere of the brain works is it celebrates control over things. That's what it is most satisfied by, is control over things. And we're going to come back to this theme throughout this series now where we talk about McGilchrist, is control. I think that the real danger of AI is it gives us a next level, a sort of nuclear option of control over data and control over any number of forces that now influence our interconnected world. And it's not that AI is going to hurt us, it's that we are going to use AI to hurt ourselves worse than we've ever hurt ourselves before. That, to me, is the real potential danger of AI. It's left brain control on steroids, where we don't realize where the limits are. We can have nuclear bombs, and we know that if you shoot yours, or we shoot ours, then we know that you know, and then you shoot yours, and so we all die. So we're not going to do that. But what happens when we develop something so powerful that, and there's no longer any kind of mutual structure of restraint? How we use it is the real danger. How we fail to realize the potential for harming ourselves. That, to me, is the real concern with AI. He continues, we have been seriously misled, I believe, because we have depended on that aspect of our brains that is most adept at manipulating the world in order to bend it to our purposes. The brain is importantly divided into two hemispheres. You could say, to sum up a vastly complex matter in a phrase, that the brain's left hemisphere is designed to help us apprehend and thus manipulate the world, the right hemisphere to comprehend, to see it for what it is. The problem is that the very brain mechanisms which succeed in simplifying the world so as to subject it to our control militate against a true understanding of it. This is the true core of his book. I just want to read that sentence again. The very brain mechanisms which succeed in simplifying the world so as to subject it to our control militate against a true understanding of it. Meanwhile, compounding the problem, we take the success we have in manipulating it as proof that we understand it. But that is a logical error. To exert power over something requires us only to know what happens when we pull the levers, press the button, or utter the spell. And I love that because it brings us right back to this question of enchantment, right? What is enchantment? It's to utter a spell. And what is the nature of magic? Why is the church against enchantment? Why is the church against magic? Because enchantment, or magic as it is understood in its context, is a way of controlling and manipulating the world, not experiencing God through the world sacramentally, right? This is why things like dabbling with witchcraft and the occult are so spiritually dangerous, because they're about trying to name a thing not so that we can glorify God with it or through it, but so that we can control it and gain mastery over it, which is an inherently demonic thing to do, right? But that's the way we valued the way we relate to the world. Control, manipulate, reduce, simplify, separate, systematize. And doing that does give us control over it, but it doesn't help us understand it. It doesn't help us understand it. I'll stop there. But one of the paradoxes of this book, and I think is one of the things that makes it worth our time, and is central to this conversation that we're having and his relationship then to Taylor, although he's not directly interacting with Taylor. The paradox is this. While McGilchrist understands and articulates the functioning of the brain and its delusions on matters of perception from an evolutionary biological perspective, he concludes that the sacredness of the world is more true to its actual reality, despite his own agnosticism. Right? In other words, what he's saying is if we learn to see the world whole, with both sides of our brain functioning, and through our culture, through, most importantly for us, our Orthodox way of being, we will experience everything as sacred. We will experience everything as whole. In other words, when the way we pay attention to the world unifies and right balance both hemispheres, we see the sacredness of reality, the interconnectedness of all things, the numinous, relationality in everything, communion, personalism, everything, etc. We approach something like what we Orthodox describe as a noetic approach to knowledge and to what is true. And the noetic approach is to understand that there is a perception of the soul that resides in the heart that provides an integrative experience of reality. That we don't simply know things with our brain, particularly just with our left brain, but we know the whole of it through the heart and through a spiritual manner of living. I think personally that, and I'm going to link a video after this session. I want you to hear McGilchrist also in his own words in an interview. I think that what explains to a large degree his agnosticism is simply this. He experiences the world as sacred, and he might favor a sort of Christian articulation of that on some level, but he's also, as a researcher, looking at the sacredness of the world through Native American religion, through Christianity, through Judaism, through Islam, and especially Jewish, Christian, and Islamic mysticism, through Buddhism, through Hinduism. He's saying, look, this isn't just the way one group sees the world. This is how everybody always saw the world. And that's what Taylor was saying is true as well before the birth of modernity. That's how the whole world functioned. And as some of you have pointed out, if you travel to India today, if you travel to sub-Saharan Africa today, or South America on the Day of the Dead, you're going to find a still very enchanted world where people look through different lenses, but they still see a world shot through a spiritual reality. But you come into our culture and you see a world that's strictly material. It's strictly utilitarian. It's mechanistic. It's scientific in its application of all things. It defines progress in terms of strict human well-being and not the glory of God, not the appeasement of spirits, good or bad. So, in other words, you can look at these questions from any number of different religious angles. And McGilchrist is simply, I guess you could say he's enough of a researcher and not a practitioner that he sees these things and says that they're true, and he affirms that they're true, but he doesn't commit to them. But the really interesting thing is that if you understand our own culture, you perceive this correctly, all right? The world is not reduced to mechanized components, but comes alive with flow and meaning and purpose. In other words, many people who take a non-sacred view of the world have come to believe that this is just the way the world is. It's material, it's accidental, it has no purpose or meaning, it's mundane, right? Just like Taylor was describing the sort of symptom of the secular two mindset. We simply see the world as it is, and you're adding something to it to try to make it sacred or to give it meaning. And I won't rehash nominalism, but this is basically the nominalistic point of view, okay? Like Taylor, McGilchrist is showing that this perspective is merely itself a construct, that we can unlearn it and relearn to see the world more fully as it is. He's suggesting that the nature of reality is more like the pre-nominalist view of reality as sacred ordered cosmos, only rightly understood ritually and sacrally. And he is doing so from the perspective of neuroscience. Let me just share something else. From this follows an account of who we are, on which nothing less than our future depends. What in particular I offer here is a new synthesis of philosophy and science, which I believe is importantly and excitingly liberating to both parties. As a rule, philosophy and science go on as if the other did not exist. Scientists tend to see philosophy as a luxury they can't afford to get involved with, a ball and chain that will slow them down in their race for the next discovery. Philosophers to see science as somewhat beneath them, and in any case irrelevant to the ponderings of the mind on itself. But as the great physicist Erwin Schrödinger put it in Science and Humanism, and now he's quoting Schrödinger, it seems plain and self-evident, yet it needs to be said. The isolated knowledge obtained by a group of specialists in a narrow field has in itself no value whatsoever, but only in its synthesis with all the rest of knowledge, and only inasmuch as it really contributes in this synthesis toward answering the demand, who are we? Who are we? And he points out that Schrödinger is sort of channeling Plotinus here, but we won't get stuck on there. Who are we? Christianity doesn't come down to us as an abstraction. It's not a set of writings and teachings or data to be mastered. Our Orthodox faith comes to us embodied in the saints, embodied in the liturgy. We attend to the witness of saints because the saints actually synthesize and embody the whole and lead to fullness. New converts have a tendency today to want to jump on the internet and make arguments. They want to master theology, read lots of books, systematize it, come up with all their arguments, go online, start their own YouTube channel, and make arguments. And what's the problem with that? The problem is orthodoxy isn't meant to be mastered. You don't read theological books. You don't read St. Maximus the Confessor to master him. You enter into our theology to embody it and to be healed. And this takes time. You can't be Orthodox 1 month and then say, let me go online and save the world. You can't do that, right? You haven't been nurtured enough in the faith. You can master ideas, but now all you're doing, if you assault everyone else with your ideas, is you're doing this totally left-brain, westernized thing that is not Orthodox, right? They don't fully comprehend what it is they don't know yet. That's the reality. It takes years to really know how to live this Orthodox life and faith in the flesh. To this end, we can see control as a major way of understanding the difference between embodied noetic knowledge and the grasping of modernity. It's all about control. And we fall into it because of the way that we were educated. We were talking a little bit at the end of last class, this debate in schools between phonics and whole language models. Is that the right? Yeah, for teaching children to read, do you teach them sounds and teach them to sound out words and then let them start to read, or you just do the philosophy of whole, what is it called? Whole language reading. And this is very interesting. This is Eileen's field, and it's something that I actually read an essay or article about recently. There's a huge furor right now that there was never any great evidence that whole language worked very well when we abandoned phonics. And I had this own experience when I grew up, and I'm sure many of you, we grew up and we learned how to graph a sentence, right? To break down a sentence into, well, not graph it, diagram a sentence, yeah. We had to diagram sentences, and it was a very left-brain way of looking at of language. We're going to break it down into component parts, see how they intersect and relate, and then put it all back together. But both parts of that were necessary. Notice we're using our left brain to break it down, and then we're putting it back together. And so you can argue, like, the problem with phonics is they don't understand, they can just make sounds, and the problem with whole language is that they don't know how to read. And a lot of people go into universities today, and I know this, and some of you who have taught know it's kind of embarrassing when you have college students hand in essays. It's very clear that I mean, like, what is this? You know, honestly, this is what everyone's going through in higher education right now. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So Eileen's going with whole language, just to be on the just to be on on the record here. Yes, but these are examples of how this kind of debate works, and the grasping of modernity. So modern knowledge encourages us to take a reductive approach to things, break them down, categorize them, gain mastery over them, and use this mastery to control outcomes. That's very much the nature of the world we look at, that we have outside these walls. And that's because we perceive the world as pointing to nothing but itself, which is nominalism. It doesn't have any meaning until we give it meaning, right? And we can use the world only in as much as we choose to manipulate and control it for the sake of human flourishing. In other words, and we can't stress this enough, we don't live in a world that is the way it is only because of progress, as if the Industrial Revolution occurred when it did only because then we were finally sophisticated and intelligent and had enough information to unleash it. It happened because of the different way we attended to reality, right? And if there is an aspect of what we're talking about that seems to get stuck somewhere in your head, like, why isn't this not coming together for me? I think it's because so many of us were taught that we live in the age of progress, that the Industrial Revolution occurred because we just know better than everyone who occurred before the Industrial Revolution. And the technological revolution occurred because, well, we're just smarter than everybody who lived before us. And we have discovered these things, and we are improving the world. And this is the purpose of the whole world, is for us to use it in this way. And this is the fullness of time that McGilchrist, I think, is really talking about. We have so reduced the world to a mechanism of our own devising that we don't even know what it is anymore, and we don't even know what we are anymore. And we're starting to wonder, should we just merge with machines or let machines do all the thinking for us? Wouldn't that make the world even better? Maybe we should just colonize Mars, right? We're getting lost. We've been getting lost for the last few hundred years. That's what McGilchrist is arguing. And it's because of the way we tend to the world. A few further thoughts, and then I'm going to give a couple of examples and say a few more things before we close for the night. I know we got a little early start here, but one of the things I wanted to point out, and this is reading the Rod Dreher book and also reading McGilchrist, is we're very much, we talked about last time this whole idea of are you left-brained and are you right-brained and why that was problematic. McGilchrist addresses the limitations of that thing. But it's still easy for us to fall back into, oh, this is about whether or not you're left-brained or right-brained. That is not his thesis, right? It's easy to fall into it because many of us grew up thinking that way. But his thesis is not some people are just left-brained and some people are just right-brained. That would be a fairly, we could cover that in 10 minutes and move on to something more interesting if that's what all his book was about. And the problem is that's an either-or formulation. Either you're left-brained or you're right-brained. No, you're whole-brained. Unless there's something wrong with your brain and we can study you in the lab and draw conclusions about how different brain pathologies influence your perception of reality. And we're going to do that here in a second. But he doesn't seek to contrast the usefulness of left versus right or vice versa. We need both. We need the whole. But the reason that is hard for us is we've forgotten how to do that. We so value the reductive, controlling, systematizing approach to knowledge and truth that our perception of things is that we've forgotten how to engage the whole of it, all right? So there's a couple of things that I think are necessary for us to begin to understand how to merge these two realities. How do we engage an orthodox perspective on reality through our spiritual practice and our noetic understanding of knowledge? How do we understand the way our own brains are working against us and cause a lot of our own problems? there are things that we need, and first and foremost, we need humility. One of the themes that McGilchrist comes across more and more is that the left brain is not very good at knowing what it doesn't know, or assuming that there must be things it doesn't know. It's very good at managing the task at hand, but not very good at seeing the big picture. And the thing that gets lost is humility. With humility, I can approach any problem in life, particularly complicated problems. I'm not talking about how to put an piece of IKEA furniture together. Your left brain's going to help you just fine doing that, right? That's not something that you necessarily need a whole brain approach to. But with humility, I assume there is more to this matter or this thing than I am currently aware. Humility is a kind of break on jumping to the conclusions that we're trained to jump to using only a left hemisphere way of managing our perception of reality. The other is obedience. Obedience is an interesting way of thinking about this, and it's not so much featured in McGilchrist, but it's what I've been sort of dwelling upon, is that when we come into the Orthodox faith, we understand that we're part of something much bigger than we are. And when someone first comes into, well, let's use this, let's sort of remove it from our own experience. When you first become a monastic, it doesn't matter if you have 3 PhDs, and by the way, I've known monks with 3 PhDs before they went into the monastery. It doesn't matter how many books you've read and how brilliant you are and how many books you've written. When you go into the monastery, you be quiet, right? Because you're not here to live in your head. You're not here to impress anybody or everybody with your knowledge or your intelligence or your articulativeness. You're here to repent. You're here to be filled with all the fullness of God. You're here to encounter God in the temple of your heart, and you need to be silent to do that. And it takes obedience and a structure of obedience around us to give us the freedom to say, you know what? I get to shut up now. I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have to express my opinions about everything. I don't have to argue with people over silly things. I can just be quiet because God dwells in the still small voice. And it is somewhat paradoxically obedience that gives us the freedom to silence our thoughts, to silence our ideas, to stop assuming our own superiority on all things, and to simply let this tradition nurture and give birth to the person we're becoming. But that's what orthodoxy is. It is a living, breathing organism. The church is a living, breathing body. And obedience in the church, even in the parish, which is totally different than the obedience in a monastery, but it's still the obedience of saying, I come into this space to be transformed by what God is doing. I don't come into this space to transform it according to my own will or purpose, even if I think I'm serving it for that reason, right? I learn how to be quiet. I learn how to be still. I've got to have trust to do that. And more importantly, I've got to know that obedience allows me to not be in charge, to not be grasping, to not be controlling, and to simply let it flow. And that's precisely when we're free to experience it as reality. So let me give you a couple of examples of this, and then we'll talk about some concrete things that McGilchrist is going to say that'll help us get into next week, which next week we sort of take some of his insights of brain science and ask, therefore, what is true, okay? So first of all, I want to share a concrete example of something that I stumbled upon several years ago, and that I'm not sure how I understood it at the time, but McGilchrist has helped me understand myself a little bit better. I began to realize in parish ministry, and this was while we were in Texas, that oftentimes when a problem arose in the parish or some kind of challenge or large decision arose, I began to realize that my first instinct about how to solve any given problem was always wrong. The only reason I realized that my first instinct was always wrong is I kept acting on my first instinct, and it wasn't producing the things that I hoped it would produce, okay? Now, when I say it was always wrong, it's not that it was wrong in the sense that I'm just a bumbling fool and I can't figure out how to tie my shoes. It was wrong because what I began to realize is that when I acted quickly on my perception, I didn't see the whole picture. I didn't see the whole picture. But also, I began to realize that there was something inside of me personally that said, well, if this is a problem, we better fix it right now. Because we don't like to live with problems. We don't like to live with unresolved tensions. We don't like to live with ambiguity. So if I respond very quickly to a problem and then take my need to want to control it very quickly, guess what? I end up misidentifying the scope of the problem and then misapplying the correct solution. And I could give you examples. I don't want to derail us too far on this, but very quickly I'll give you one example of this where we were in the process of building a temple, or trying to build a temple, trying to design, before we were building, trying to design a temple. And we had several missed, or what's the word I'm looking for? Missed starts. We worked with a designer, that didn't work out. And then we tried to go back to them, and that didn't work out. And we were kind of hitting a dead end and not knowing how to move forward. And then I suddenly had this revelation. Let's not build a new temple. Let's renovate the space we're already worshiping in, and we can do this and we can do that. And I had all these great ideas, and in my mind, boy, I had like the blueprint, right? The game plan. And everyone was going to hear this and be like so relieved. Oh, we've solved the problem, and this will get us through the next several years, and then we can worry about building. So I gathered together my people. I said, I have something very exciting to share with you. And I shared this whole vision of renovating the space that we were using, and they all looked at me and said, no. Like, not a single one thought this was a good idea. And I was so deflated. I was like, what do you mean it's not a good idea? It's such a great idea. Like, I knew it was a great idea, but it was an example where I was looking at it with a very narrow lens. And I was wrong. I was just flat out wrong. So here's what happened. I began to change the way I operate in the parish. And this can frustrate people because they mistake it sometimes for inaction. But I began to realize that with any given problem, the more serious the problem is, or the more complex it is, the more time it takes to fully understand it. And that you have to develop the patience and the humility and the obedience to say, first and foremost, my initial response is, I probably am not seeing all the angles of this right now. I have to have humility to be able to say that. I'm not trying to make myself sound like I'm humble, but the only reason you get humility is because you humiliate yourself through accident and through mistakes, right? So I've humiliated myself enough in the past that I know I don't see the whole picture right away. And that generally speaking, what I found was that if I waited 3 months or 6 months or a year and kept praying about something, I began to see it differently. I began to see that the thing that I thought was the problem was not the problem at all. There was something much deeper that I wasn't paying attention to, okay? And only by taking time could I actually then come to a resolution. By the time I came to the resolution, it was free. You don't have to, when you see a thing holy, no one, this is my experience in parish ministry, no one feels threatened by it because you're seeing the whole. What we feel threatened by in each other in the parish is when we only see a portion. And there's something in us that says, nope, that's not quite right? And thankfully, I've had people in my past who have told me, no, Father, that's not quite right. You're off on something here. But we need that. So what I realized was, in reading McGilchrist, is that in a certain way, what I was actually doing to different challenges in the church is I was using my education to break it down, simplify it, reduce it, systematize it, control it, grasp it, manipulate it, and now I'm going to solve it. And what I realized was I needed to bring another perspective. I needed to look around the backside, if you will. And only time will do that. Only the humility of saying, I probably don't understand this yet. Let's give it some time. We solve a lot of problems when we simply slow down. And patience is a major factor of the way our brains actually work. That's why the pace of the world that we live in mitigates very much against wisdom. Everything's got to happen, and it's got to happen now in the way that we live. You go back 600 years, oh my goodness. They had a totally different relationship to time, a totally different relationship to how long something took. I'm always stunned at reading the lives of saints, and or even in the scriptures. St. Paul is traveling here, he gets sidetracked. Oh, well, I guess I'll just spend the whole winter in this city instead. It's like, wow, like think about that for a minute. Who has the time to do that in our world? Nobody. Nobody can just accidentally winter in a different harbor because they got blown off course on their journey. They had a totally different relationship to time, to where they belonged, to how long it took to do something. They might make decisions by writing letters, and months would go by of letters going back and forth before a profound decision was made. We make a movie of that very thing, and it's all made right in the moment because we won't understand what it takes to actually take 8 months to make a complex decision. Even military maneuvers often took months to work out, but we dramatize them in our films as, the general sees it all and, gives the charge, and off we go. So we need time. We need patience. The world that we've constructed mitigates against that. And it means that we're often acting unwisely and shooting ourselves in the foot because we don't understand what it is that we're actually dealing with. Here's just a couple other examples. We'll come back to this one in The Ethics of Beauty by Dr. Batitsas, but something that impacted why our church came here when it did was urban renewal. Those of you who lived through the 50s, 60s, 70s, those were periods of urban renewal in which we were asking, what is a city for? And part of the story there of why our cities look the way they would do is the assumptions of the city planners of that era. We're going to look at this very concretely of where disasters occurred on this, but where successes also occurred. But beauty was considered to have no meaning, and cities were no longer living, breathing organisms, but they were became places of office space and shopping. And so what do you do with that? You tear down old neighborhoods with mom and pop stores and grocers and shoe repair, and you put highways into cities so that you can get cars in great volume, and you transform the American city to be something that nobody lives in, but everyone visits for various reasons, right? This even in the early 2000s, this was the debate for Pittsburgh. How many of you remember, who was the mayor, Tom, in the early 2000s, no, not Ridge. He was the mayor of Pittsburgh. Anyway. No, I don't know. Anyway, very thick Pittsburgh accent. But maybe this will ring a bell. How many of you remember when the big debate was, is the future of the downtown Pittsburgh area going to be where people want to live and shop and work and worship, or is it going to be where we put in Nordstrom? Right? We got Nordstrom. It's right over there. It's up here. But back then, they wanted to put it downtown. And they wanted to clear out the whole Liberty Avenue corridor. Does this ring a bell for anybody? All the wig shops, all the hat shops, all the nail salons, all these little privately owned businesses on Liberty Avenue in downtown. They wanted to get rid of all of those because they wanted Nordstrom to come in. Because Nordstrom would be the draw, and people would want to drive into Pittsburgh to go to Nordstrom. And the debate was, okay, we're either going to get rid of all the local character of our city so that Nordstrom is happy and put in Nordstrom and make it a downtown shopping area, or we're going to start developing living spaces downtown and make it a livable city again. Well, we chose this, and the $600 million thing that's happening in downtown Pittsburgh now, notice how much of that is apartments, and taking an entire skyscraper and reconverting offices into apartments. A new generation wants to live in downtown areas rather than in suburbs, right? And so this is another example of how we look at something determines how we think it should be used. This will become a little bit more clear later. Um, Let me move on to McGilchrist, and I want to just read through. So one of the things he does in part one of his book is he describes the way that the brain works in relationship to several categories: attention, perception, judgment, apprehension, emotional and social intelligence, cognitive intelligence, and creativity. And he gives examples of all of these, and these are really interesting and they're very entertaining. I just want to take time to look at two of these, the ones that I think are most important for us to sort of continue to think about as Orthodox Christians. And the first one is in attention. And this should hopefully ring a bell when we say attention, because what do we say in our services? A lot. Let us attend, right? Depending on the translation, is let us attend or let us be attentive. Have you ever thought, what is the deacon asking me to do there? Well, but in what way? Like, why? This is a strange thing to say. Like, Western Christians, they don't call out, let us attend. They don't do that at all. What is it asking us to do? Well, consider this, because attention is a major theme that McGilchrist emphasizes, and I think it's a major theme for us. Attention is the way we relate to something, okay? And attention does not just change things in some rather nebulous way. Attention is responsible not just for the how, not just for the what, but as far as the left hemisphere of the brain is concerned, for the whether at all of existence. What it doesn't attend to, as far as the left hemisphere is concerned, doesn't exist. So this is very interesting. What it doesn't attend to, as far as the left hemisphere of the brain is, doesn't exist. So there's a famous example of this, but there's many examples of this, called the gorillas in our, what is it called? Gorillas in Our Midst. Has anyone heard this? There's a video test. It's called Gorillas in Our Midst. You show someone a video. You've heard of this? Okay. You show someone a video, and it's of a basketball game, and you tell the person, I want you to pay very close attention and count the number of times that one of the teams passes the ball. All right? So they're watching a screen, and they've been given a task, and they're paying very close attention, and they're looking, okay, how many times are they passing the ball? While they're watching the screen, a man in a gorilla suit walks to the center of the court, turns to face the camera, does a kind of strike a pose and dances a jig, and then walks off. And most people watching this video never see the gorilla. You just never see him. Why is that? Because you have been given a very specific task that has lit up the left hemisphere of your brain and the way that the left hemisphere of the brain likes to pay attention, and it's counting, and it's looking at the ball, and it's looking at the players, and literally, it can't see the gorilla. Now, once you point out, did you know there was a gorilla in the video, and the person rewatches it, they can't believe. They think it was a different video. They can't believe that there was a gorilla in the video and they didn't see it. But that's one of the ways our brains plays tricks on us. And it's one of the important ways where the way we pay attention determines whether we think something is there at all. Do you see how important this is to understanding the sacredness of the world? If I learn to count something in the world, if I learn to reduce the way I relate to the world, there are whole dimensions that I'm not even seeing because I'm not paying attention to them at all. So that's an example. Left hemisphere attention is sharply restricted in space and time, which is, after all, the four-dimensional world we live in. It tends towards precision, but at the expense of depth. It is no longer true to the expansive, always moving, always changing, endlessly interconnected nature of reality. One way of putting it is that the left hemisphere can provide some sorts of knowledge about the world as it would be scrutinized from a certain theoretical point of view, effectively outside the realms of space and time, as on a map, and the left brain loves maps, by the way, whereas the right hemisphere provides us with the knowledge of the world in space and time as it's experienced. Constraining attention, left hemisphere fashions, makes coherent wholes dissolve and brings things to a standstill, and reality leaches out. So this is one way in which we learn to pay attention in such a way that we cannot interpret reality the way that it actually is. And what McGilchrist is arguing is, yeah, we all can be given a task and not realize there was a man in a gorilla suit in a video. But that's less important to the fact that the very world that we live in, the world that we've shaped, has been shaped by this way of attending to it. And that's why it feels so material and non-spiritual and non-sacred to us, right? That's why we make things that aren't beautiful anymore. We don't even care. We just utilize things. They don't have to be that way, but we do it that way. And the other thing we can say is that the left hemisphere is, when it comes to perception, or when it comes to attention, the left hemisphere is quite confident that it is right. And this is, again, going back to my example of how I function in parish life. I had to realize that when I felt, I had literal experiences where in moments where I felt right, I was wrong. Okay? So in retrospect, I got something wrong. Why did I feel so right about something, but in fact I was completely wrong? It's because I was paying attention to it in the wrong way. And I was using my own sort of left brain approach to solving problems instead of just letting things come organically to a sense of fullness. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? So it's a good image, the Gorillas in Our Midst video, where something's right in front of you and you don't see it. And we probably all have this experience as well. When in our household, my nickname is the Finder. For whatever reason, if Madishka misplaces something and is looking for it, 9 times out of 10, I'm the one who sees it sitting right there. And why is that? Well, we're probably paying attention to our environment in 2 entirely different ways. Neither is right or wrong. You need both, but it's just a way of paying attention where sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us. Perception is another one. And let me just, this is very short. In every sensory modality, the right hemisphere appears to have an advantage over the left when it comes to primary perception. Perceptual distortions and hallucinations in each sensory modality are strongly associated with right hemisphere dysfunction, i.e., you had a stroke in the right hemisphere of your brain or a brain trauma. Thus, as far as both attention and perception go, the right hemisphere is a more important guide and a more reliable one to the overall nature of reality. Now, there's a lot of examples of this, but I can give you a couple, and these largely come from schizophrenia as a condition, a clinical condition of schizophrenia. But when we just have volumes of scientific evidence that when the right brain is damaged in some way, it changes our perception of reality. So we might, someone who, again, these are taken from subjects with schizophrenia that are clearly having a kind of right hemisphere dysfunction. In terms of shape, I saw a man who suddenly had the teeth and nose of a rabbit. Or houses float, walls move in and drift away. Objects appear in odd proportions. Streets seem to tilt, walls of buildings closing in. When I look down at the lower part of my body, it constantly feels twisted and displaced to the left compared to the rest of the body. These are all warpings of our perception of reality, and they're all associated with right hemisphere damage. You can read the book if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the science of it, but something like over 80% of these things happen through right hemisphere damage. There's more entertaining ones when we get to judgment. And here, judgment, let me just read very quickly what he emphasizes about judgment and then give you some examples. because these get really wild. Virtually all delusional syndromes are more commonly the result of right hemisphere than left hemisphere dysfunction. The degree to which this is the case is broadly proportional to the bizarre nature of the delusion involved, and no delusional syndrome is commoner in left than right hemisphere dysfunction. Just again, a couple of examples here that are fascinating, but also troubling. And I don't mean to make light of them, but things like delusional misidentification, lycanthropy. Everyone know what lycanthropy is. It's the delusional belief, judgment that you are actually a wolf. And it's considered to be the origin of the werewolf sort of phenomenon. People take off all their clothes and go running through the forest and howling at the moon and even tearing at things with their teeth. This is very much dependent on right hemisphere deficits. Paranoia, the belief that someone's following you, or that you're the head of MI5, or that you've become Jesus Christ. All kinds of delusional identification things are largely dependent on right hemisphere dysfunction. Cotard's delusion is very interesting. In Cotard's delusion, patients believe themselves to be already dead. In their mind, they are dead. And they're telling people around them, I'm dead, you need to bury me. And they literally believe that they are a corpse. They don't believe that blood is flowing through their veins. And even McGilchrist had a patient like this. He said, well, do you mind if I take blood? I need to take a blood sample. Do you mind if I take a blood sample? And they're like, you can try, but there's no blood there. I'm already dead. And so he took the blood and showed them the blood, and they said, boy, you put that there. You tricked me, right? So this is a delusional syndrome that's almost always associated with right hemisphere dysfunction. The important thing is it warps your perception of reality. And this can get really, really crazy. In one, there's an example of, there's a special name for this. Let me see if I get this right. Capgras syndrome. Has anyone heard of that one, Capgras syndrome? An example of this, one man believed his stepfather was a cleverly disguised robot, chopped his head off with a chainsaw looking for batteries and microchips. He honestly believed that his stepfather was a robot. Right? So this is related to Cotard's delusion, where you're just not perceiving reality correctly anymore, right? So what's frightening about this, and obviously we don't mean to make light of these things, although they are wild to think of, but what's frightening about this is that you can have a minor stroke, you can have a bump on the head that can damage your right hemisphere of your brain and completely alter your perception of reality, completely alter your perception of yourself. There's other syndromes. Again, if you're interested in this, please buy the book, but people decide they look at a limb and they think that they have an intruding limb on their body, and they start to yell at it and curse it and abuse it, and sometimes even want to cut it off because they're convinced that, for instance, their left arm shouldn't be there. That's not mine. Get it away from me, right? Their brain is playing, in a sense, a trick on them. So one of the things that, and that's one example of the altered role of the body. Anorexia nervosa is another condition of the altered perception of the body, where someone is literally starving to death and in a completely emaciated state, but the patient actually believes that they are grotesquely obese and will starve themselves to death, and they cannot see the reality of what they're doing to each other. And anorexia nervosa is often related to hemispheric lesion. Right? There's a right hemispheric lesion that tends to drive that condition. Not always. And McGilchrist is very humble about scientific conclusion about all of this. But the trend is so clear. Mess with the right side of your brain, and the whole world turns upside down, basically, is the way of putting it most plainly. And I don't want to go into all of these because we'll just be here too long, but again, you can do this with apprehension, you can do this with creativity, cognitive intelligence, emotional and social intelligence. Each hemisphere of the brain has its role to play in all of these things, and when they're playing together, when they're whole, they perceive the truth of the world, and what I emphasized last week, and it's really important to remember, McGilchrist isn't taking a position of this sort of phenomenology where, oh, the world is just oh, I'm blanking. It's not just a computer simulation. It's not unreal. We're not creating the world, but we are participating in the creation of the world when we perceive it, right? That quantum science helps us understand that on a micro level as well. But it's true that there's the matter with things is that they exist independently of us, but we don't experience them other than through participating in their existence. And so this is a very whole way of being that's very, very much in concert with our Orthodox way. One Orthodox commentator recently called McGilchrist Orthodox adjacent because his worldview is so it so links with our own, but from a totally different angle. Okay, well, let's stop there. There's a lot more I had on my list today, but like we did with Taylor, we just need to move on because there's just too much to do. But this was part one of the book, and it was just a way of saying the way we pay attention, the way we perceive, and the way we use our brains in this world that we've created for ourselves through modernity affects our perception of reality, and it impacts our ability to see what is true and what the ways of truth are. So the next section McGilchrist is doing is really asking what is true, which is a philosophical question. We noticed this with Taylor, what is good? Now with McGilchrist, what is true? When we get to Petitsis, we're going to ask what is beautiful. But what is true, and how does each of us, in each of our lives, how does our brain help us navigate what is true, but also collectively, how do we engage the truth as a body? Okay? Very good. Have a good night.